Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Ask Amity Show. I'm Jennifer here with Cindy. Today, we'd like to talk to you about the top 6 tips for rental property that's already in your living trust. So as a landlord, if you've recently purchased a property or have this property in your living trust and you're renting it out, we wanted to share with you certain tips that you may want to keep in mind just to make sure that things are protected, you have good tenants, and so forth. So the first tip that I'd like to share with you is how to manage the property like a professional. So even if you're a quote unquote mom and pop real estate investor, it's a good idea to interact with your tenants and manage your rental property as if you were a professional property management company. So what does that mean? Communicating with your tenant, interacting with them in a clear and cordial manner, professionally. I think that's always very important. And then, that way tenants know that you're really on top of things. You are personally managing the property and that it's taken very seriously. So that you follow through with all the formalities like collecting rent. And if it's late, then you would, put them on notice and collect late payments, checking in on the property to make sure that it's maintained, and then just making sure things are repaired promptly, and if necessary, start the eviction process if they have been breaching the lease agreement or no payment is made. And Cindy would like to share with you our second tip.
Yeah, the second tip, this is part of looking like a professional, is to make sure you use a screening process. So one of the most challenging parts of being a landlord is choosing a quality tenant. Screening tenants is hard. If your rental is priced competitively in the market and it's in good condition, then it's likely that you're going to get a lot of interest from prospective tenants. A well thought out screening process with established requirements for tenants will help weed out tenants who won't qualify because of eviction history, low income, or other factors like owning a pet. From there, have the tenant complete a written rental application, confirm their rental history, and review their income. Many landlords follow the 3x rent per month rule, which means that the tenant must make at least 3 times the rent rate of each month. Running a credit check and a background check is standard in rental real estate, but it's not the only thing that matters. It's a red flag for renters if your screening process is not thorough. You do not want to give the impression that you're going to let anyone live in your rental unit. So make sure that you give off the impression that you are highly selective and, as you should be, selective of your tenants.
Yes, and then our third tip is, have a very thorough, well-written lease. Your lease agreement is everything as a landlord. It's a binding contract that explains what the landlord and the tenants can and cannot do and states the process for what happens if the lease is broken. So throwing a 2-page lease together may cut it for the time being, but eventually something may happen. And if it's not properly addressed in the lease agreement, that becomes a problem. So your lease should include some basic terms, clauses, and languages according to the state landlord-tenant laws, and can be drafted by a real estate attorney. And your lease should address items such as like lawn maintenance, parking, property alterations like painting the walls, pet clauses if you're allowing pets for the landlord, pest control, property use. So if you're renting a residential property, you want to have the unit be used only for living, not for running a business, and then explicitly state what the property can and cannot be used for. Also, who the tenants are. So who's going to be occupying the rental property. You want to make sure that you have, all of the individuals who are supposed to be residing there listed. If they have family members, perhaps include the number of family members or the maximum, number of family members who can reside there. And then also whether or not subletting is allowed. I know it's quite popular for a lot of tenants to perhaps want to rent out an individual room to help, with the rental payments. So you want to make sure that you state whether or not that's allowed, because many times that type of language, it's more or less contingent on the tenant, him or herself, to decide who to sublet to. So you may want to say subletting is allowed pending authorization or written authorization from the landlord, something like that. So the more details you put in the lease agreement, the better, because it addresses any sort of issues that may arise in the future.
The fourth tip is to make sure you increase your rental rate annually according to the market rent. Now, this is sort of a dependent on your unit, your tenant, the upgrades. All that is very basically case-by-case basis. So annual rental increases are a normal part of owning rental real estate. And it's suggested that new landlords, do implement them. You don't want to fall too far behind on your rental rate, just because catching up to the market rate may prove a little difficult, especially considering the size of the increase. If you have an increase in a long time, it's much harder to for a tenant to swallow like a large increase than to have incremental increase throughout the years. But before you increase your rent, make sure you are aware of any rent control laws that are applicable to your area. And the fact that you can increase, again, just because you can increase doesn't mean that it's necessarily justified. Sometimes keeping the rent below market value is a good idea to keep really good tenants.
Right. And so the tip number 5 is keeping good tenants with incentives. Good tenants don't come easily. So we want to make sure that once we do find a good tenant, we want to keep them. So one way to motivate the tenant to stay, even if you are increasing the rent, is to offer them certain incentives to renew. So each year upon lease renewal, what you can do is offer to replace or upgrade something within the property up to a certain value, perhaps putting in a new fan or new flooring, new paint, adding a backsplash, something like that, to incentivize your good tenant to stay and renew their lease agreement, even if you are increasing rent. So they don't have to be very expensive upgrades, and a little can go a long way. It's just important to let the tenant know that they can choose the item that they choose to want to upgrade. And as long as it's within a certain dollar amount, and this way it gives them a sense of ownership and tells them that their voice is heard and valued.
And the last tip is that even though you're going to have your own landlord's insurance, when a property is in the trust, make sure you definitely still have insurance to protect the property, but you also want to require your tenant to have renter's insurance. So it's a really good idea to have the tenant buy the renter's insurance so that it protects their belongings and provides additional liability protection to you as a landlord, especially if the property has pets or any kind of unique personal items or anything like that. So you want to make sure that there's enough insurance coverage that will cover all of that. So that's all the tips for rental properties in a trust. It's a lot like owning rental properties outside the trust, but here there's an added additional layer that is in the trust. It's owned by the trust. So you want to make sure that your lease agreement clearly states that the trust is the landlord. But most of the tips are very similar to properties that are also held outside the trust. So that's all we have for you today. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you can see more videos that are that you may find applicable to you, relating to real estate, estate planning, probate, and yeah, so that's all we have for you today. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.